Billy says, then another question, with us, the view prevails with the earth people what descendants would have to follow in the footsteps of their parents, usually in those of the fathers. By this, I mean that, for example, a son or several sons, if there are several of these, would take on the same occupation of his father, or if one or another exists, would take over his company or business and continue it on. How is this with you? Do the same views exist with you? Quetzal says, no, that is not the case. All descendants are entirely free in their choice of activity, so there is never a desire that children must perform the same activity, etc., as their parents, neither in relation to the father nor mother, and, thus, neither a son nor a daughter. So, for example, parents can be an Ishwish and or Ishrish, while a son of theirs learns a simple craft, as this can also be the case for a daughter. Parents always only play an advisory role with their descendants, but it is never insisted by them that the descendants would have to turn to a specific activity, etc. And before you ask, this also has reference to the choice of a partner as well as to the education of the descendants and, of course, also to the home of choice, etc. Billy says, I think that's good. It also corresponds to my sense. Then another question, do you actually know a lot about the sailor's yarn? Quetzal says, you see me without understanding. What does sailor's yarn mean? The term is unknown to me. Billy says, oh, excuse me. Unbelievable and fantastic stories that are told by sailors are called sailor's yarn. Quetzal says, do you mean stories about Calphaitans? Billy says, no, it has nothing to do with that. By the way, how did you come across that word? Quetzal says, it belongs to our German usage. Billy says, you can forget that word, in order to try to make yourself understandable, for this term has no longer been in use for a long time. It traces back to an old German language and means a haunt in a good or bad sense. However, this Calphaitan, respectively haunt, is a matter of the ship's kobold, which continues to be known as the ship's spirit, which means that the ship's kobolds are only of importance among the sailors but not among the landlubbers. The ship's kobold, respectively the ship's spirit, so says the popular belief, but especially the sailors' belief, knocks against the ship's planks to warn the sailors that repairs to the ship's walls must be made. But on the other hand, the ship's kobold should also announce disaster, such as a severe storm, a plague on board, or even the sinking of the ship. So it can appear in difficult situations as a good spirit or as a goblin that brings misfortune and death to the ship and its crew. This is the sailor's belief and the popular belief. Quetzal says, then the word klabusern would probably be right. Or is it klabustern? Billy says, no, because that means something else again. The term klabotten would be right. The word addressed by you is called klabustern and is a variant of klabastern. On the one hand, in the language of soldiers, it means that other people, respectively recruits, are ruthlessly drilled and compressed together and then made into useful, obedient, and disciplined soldiers. On the other hand, klabustern also refers to the so-called klabuster beer. This is a product of impurity, namely with humans and animals. These are small, dried-up excrement residues, small balls of excrement that stick in the hairs around the anus. Wait a minute, it is probably here in the dictionary. One moment, yes, here. It says the same thing as what I told you. Still in reference to klabuster beer and the language of soldiers, it is said in jargon that someone let the klabuster brain fly from his ass. Quetzal says, a harsh language. Billy says, that is just so among the earthlings. But back to the sailor's yarn. Since ancient times, sailors have told tales about sea monsters that they would have seen, and such monsters should have always had such enormous proportions that they should have pulled even large ocean-going vessels into the deep. In particular, these old stories exist about giant squid with enormously long tentacles. Have you ever tried to investigate these stories, and what should actually be thought of these, as well as of these sea monsters? Are these actually real, Or is it all, in the end, just a great sailor fabulation? Quetzal says, these sailors' stories throughout the centuries are familiar to us, and we have, in fact, endeavored to clarify them. And even though many fabulations, as you say, can be found in these sailors' stories, there existed, and there actually exists, the described sea monsters, if one wants to call them such. At the same time, there are different genera, as well as specific species that developed from these, but so far, these have not yet been discovered, respectively have not been found, by the earthly researchers and scientists. And since you speak of squid in particular, I can tell you this, that there are actually such gigantic creatures in the oceans. It's just that they live at very great depths and only rarely come to the surface of the ocean. The largest of these giant squids which we found at great ocean depths, so at a depth of more than 2,000 meters, exhibited a height of 25 meters, from which emerged 10 tentacles, which were 99.6 meters in length. But we only found this size among the cephalopods, while other gigantic animals only exhibited sizes of up to 52 meters, such as calamari. Translator's note: for one to get a rough idea as to how large the squid was that the Plierans discovered at the depths of one of Earth's oceans, a picture appears below, which corresponds to a 125-meter-long squid lying next to a standard football field. Billy says, cephalopods, so squids, which are also known to us as cuttlefishes. Quetzal says, that is correct. But now, you should slowly come to an end with your questions. Billy says, I will. But if you still have some time, then I would still have 2 or 3 questions to ask. Quetzal says, certainly. Billy says, good, thank you. How were Minoa and the Minoan culture destroyed? Do you know much about this? Quetzal says, the history of the earth and the history of nations fall into my area. Thus, I can give you information. 2 factors were to blame for the fall of the Minoan culture, namely, on the one hand, the disorder of the Minoan society, which was very divided in some respects and which created evil hatred in the various social structures, even due to the disagreement that the Minoan Empire threatened to fall apart. The cultural structures split apart, and soon, the whole thing threatened to degenerate into a war of the entire citizenry and, thus, of all levels of society. But before this could happen, a tremendous natural disaster occurred, namely as the Santorini volcano erupted and burst forth lava, gas, steam, and ash, whereby the ashes alone exhibited the large amount of 73.6 cubic kilometers. Also vast sulfur fumes belonged to this, whereby the whole atmosphere was so polluted and shrouded in a veil that the sun was darkened, and climatic changes emerged from this, which lasted for several years. Low temperatures arose from the veil of smoke and dust in the atmosphere, which caused many years of harvest failures. The bad and poor harvests led to the Great Famine during the following period. In addition, the Santorini volcano did the rest, for as a result of its powerful eruption and the subsequent explosion which triggered gigantic tsunamis that devastated large areas of the Minoan island when the waters raged across the island, many buildings and lands were destroyed, while very many people lost their lives. The largest tsunami, however, the huge tidal wave caused by the explosion of the volcano, rolled far across the sea to Egypt, being red with the blood of countless slaughtered aquatic animals. By what means the river Nile then colored itself red, and many people in Egypt died. But the tsunami found no end in Egypt and rolled back into the sea, where it united with another tsunami, which was generated by the explosion of the Santorini volcano, and rolled eastward, where the country was destroyed once again and people were killed when the wild waters penetrated into the country. Billy says, as a doctor, what do you know about breast cancer? What causes this? Quetzal says, as a rule, this suffering is of a gene-contingent nature. Billy says, and what gene is responsible for it? Quetzal says, I may not explain that officially but may only tell you in confidence.